Well, folks, tonight, like I said, I know I'm not what you normally get used to seeing up here, especially on a Wednesday night. Miss Christie's got things I'm sure well under control down there. But with Dad being ill, he had asked me to fill in so we didn't have to cancel Bible study tonight and we could still meet. A few months ago, he had actually asked me to fill in for him on one night. He didn't realize it was going to be tonight, but he did ask. And the topic that we were sitting there going through notes and trying to get all this ready. And we got to Revelation 12, which is coming up, I believe, in a week or two for y'all. And the topic came up of the 7 great powers of the earth, and how a lot of scholars do not know what the 7th great power will be when in the end of times. There's going to be one major nation state, the Bible scholars and the Bible tells us there's going to be a great nation state that will rise that is going to be on the attack against God, against Israel, and against God's people. The Antichrist has to come from somewhere. I think most likely will come from the political world of some sort. There's an old joke among politicians and political scientists that there's the two oldest professions in the world. The oldest profession is prostitution, and the second one is politicians. There's always been a need for those two things in somewhere in the world in some form or fashion. So the two topics that he had talked to me about, the 7th great power, and the first one is about Israel. As I was in college, I realized I did not know as much about Israel as I should. And as I talked to people over the years, a lot of Christians say, oh yeah, we support Israel, we love Israel, and then we have no clue how Israel even got on the map. Because, not to point out my grandmother, but when she was a very little girl, Israel wasn't even a country. Israel's a pretty new phenomenon as far as the map goes. So, stay here. There we go. All right. I don't have handouts. Like I said, I was kind of told at the last minute I needed to fill in. So y'all bear with me. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for this section because I want to focus more on that 7th great power. But it's impossible to understand what the world has against Israel unless we understand how Israel got to where it's at. I'm not going to cover like the 1967 wars. We're not here for a history lesson tonight, but we are here to kind of learn a little bit about the world that we have today and how that could lead, and I hope this will lead to some discussion among us. But the concept of a Jewish state comes across out of the Bible, comes out from David. We remember there's 12 tribes of Israel, and eventually one king unites all the tribes together and forms the kingdom of Israel. Well, that was King David. But the modern concept is only a few years old. In the late 1800s, there was a book that came out, translated to the Jewish state, or Der Judenstaat, and it was a major publication over in Europe. And it called for basically a revolution, a rebellion. It said that Jewish people once had a nation, they once had a place to go, they once had heritage and identity, and now they have nothing. They're just part of any other culture. So this birthed an entire movement that said, why don't we create a Jewish state, but let's put it under the model of a modern nation. Let's not go back to a king and go back to all of the exact structure that was in the days of David. But why don't we sit down and say, is it possible that we could have a country that is just for Jews, that is in the same place that King David ruled, and that it would have everything that you would see in a modern country today, like a group of lawmakers making decisions for the country, judges, the same structure that you would have in a modern nation. But as this book comes out, anytime there's a big idea that comes out, people go on the attack. Now, anti-Semitism, which is the hatred of people for their Jewish identity, has been around for thousands of years. You find it in the Bible. Jews were slaves in Egypt, slaves in Babylon, slaves in several different major nations across time. and slaves in the Roman Empire. They were persecuted more. Before Christianity's rise, Jews were the original persecuted people. Now, when attacks arose in Eastern Europe, people started fleeing. As you can imagine, we see the war in Ukraine right now. In fact, recently somebody told me that works out with me at Walmart, they said they just had this great conversation. The people, we've been in Union City for 2 weeks, they were from Ukraine. We have people who are moving to Obion County. They may never go home, they may eventually go home, but people are relocating to parts that, I imagine this has got to be an eye-opener for those Ukrainians, just like it's an eye-opener for anybody. But about 2.5 million people were forced out of their homes over the course of about 40 years. And as that happens, most of those people head for the United States. They heard it's a place that they can live, they can prosper. A lot of people start, you've seen probably old video clips, film of the big boats coming into New York Harbor right by the Statue of Liberty, full of people coming to look for a new home. And in fact, I even included this cartoon to spark a little discussion on this. You may have trouble reading it, but this is a cartoon from the 1890s and from a major paper. It's called The Stranger at Our Gate. You notice the person has on their Sabbath written on something on their back. They look a little bit more unkempt. Their bags say disease and poverty. And there's Uncle Sam saying, well, I can't tell you can't come in. We don't have a rule that says I can't tell you. The anti-Semitism, folks, is very real in this country, despite the fact that if you look at the facts and figures, the United States is the single largest supporter of Israel of any nation in the world by monetary, military support, economic value, not by trade. The European Union is a little closer to them, so they buy a lot of goods. But even though we have this heritage and this proudness, and Dad, just until this year, he had been a member of I think it was the Council on Israel and Christian Relations, or some type of organization that helps people out that had survived the Holocaust and had survived several other things. But, when we've seen anti-Semitism, I've seen it at UT Martin as a student. I remember there was I went into a restroom there and somebody had posted leaflets with a QR code, and when I scanned the QR code, it took me to this crazy website. I had to file a police report and everything because UT Martin has a zero tolerance policy for any hate speech against any group of people. It's supposed to be a place where everybody can meet and learn. As time goes, Jews had faced several years of persecution, and then things got a little better, and then a whole lot of more problems, a whole lot more issues, and things got a little better. Well, in 1921 and in 1924, the United States passed immigration restrictions on Jews coming from Europe, because we had a little under 2.5 million show up over 40 years. And you had a lot of politicians, unfortunately, a lot of Southern politicians included, that did not like the fact that somebody that spoke Hebrew or spoke Yiddish or some type of foreign language had showed up on their door. So, as that happens, there's a little man who's a painter who has failed college a couple of times, shows up on the world scene. You might know him, funny little mustache, and Charles Chaplin looks a little bit like him in a movie. But there was a lot of push because of political and military issues within Europe at that time. There was a tremendous push that takes place, and a lot of times the Jews got the blame for everything that went wrong. Why did we lose the war? Well, it's their fault. Why did this happen? Well, it's probably them. And that type of thing caught on pretty quick, especially when the fact that Hitler was considered the best speaker they'd ever heard. Imagine if we had the world's greatest speaker, we had never heard him before, and he walked in, most people would be mesmerized. no matter what he said. There's a lot of people I like to listen to, and I don't agree with one thing they say, but I think, oh, they're so good at how they say it. Well, Hitler comes to power through legal means. He rises up, and then he takes over the whole government and starts trying to conquer the world. Within a year, he had taken over not just being the chancellor, which he was appointed to do because they couldn't figure out who was going to run the country, but he then also made himself the president and supreme leader of the entire nation. And when that takes place, well, let's just put it like this. A lot of people started losing their life and losing their property and everything they had worked towards. Nazis enforced strict laws restricting Jewish ownership of property. They couldn't practice medicine. They couldn't practice the law. And eventually, they lost their ability to have a life. But a lot of people, tried to flee. An entire boat pulled into New York Harbor. And when the boat captain had informed the United States immigration at that time that it was about 2,500 Jewish people that had been liberated right before they were being sent to a death camp, the United States said, our quota's met, send them away. As far as we know, all 2,500 went to a concentration camp and eventually died. That's the best record we have, is that's when they landed, they were arrested when they arrived back in Germany. A sterilization law gets passed. He doesn't just target the Jews, he targets everybody. Everybody's going to get a little bit of the bad side of life from Adolf Hitler. And as that happens, he starts involuntarily having people euthanized because they had disabilities, because they did not look like everybody else, they didn't sound like everybody else. So he starts having people executed. So at that point, another law gets passed a little bit later. Suddenly, Jews no longer have the right to own a business. They don't have the right to marry. They don't have a right to have children. They don't have any rights whatsoever. And the worst thing imaginable, his final solution comes to play. And a mass persecution takes place. And 6 million Jews lose their life, along with another 2 million that fell into other categories. What you see there, and I put this because it is a shock factor, that's a mass grave. Those are thousands and thousands of bodies left in a large hole and covered up, and when the U.S. forces liberated, that's what they found. Illegal medical testing, that they were guinea pigs. They were lab rats to doctors that decided what it would be like if we tried to put 2 heads on one body. That's how Jews were treated. And after World War II and after the Allied powers win, the United States and Russia and China all walk out with England and France and were victorious, then we start thinking, well, what can we do to make it better? Well, suddenly, because of restrictions on immigration even to Israel, where Israel's at now, which was mandated in Palestine, people start saying, how about we just start attacking the British? They start blowing things up. They start attacking, and the United Nations said, wait a minute, we've done wrong on this. We've been doing wrong, so let's make Israel. And that's how Israel got to where it's at, in a nutshell, is after thousands of years of being persecuted, they were finally given a little piece of land right there on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, in the same land that Jesus Christ walked himself, that Moses was promised, and that Joshua led, after 40 years, led them into the promised land. They were given a promised land once again. So, as we continue and as we look, the European, there's 7 great powers. Let me back up a second. There are 7 great powers that the Bible talks about in Revelation 12. And most people think, the powers, the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire. There's several other major empires that most scholars believe are in Revelation 12. But who's the 7th? Because in the end of times, there's got to be somebody that kind of gets the ball rolling downhill. And unfortunately, we may be part of that group. Israel may actually be part of their own demise. The Bible doesn't specify, it doesn't give us guidelines. It doesn't say, well, they're going to have a good standing army and they're going to have good trade relations with China. It doesn't give us any real guidelines. It says the seventh great power will rise. So the European Union, how many of y'all, just a little show of hands, have heard of the European Union at some point in time? It's it's really not a nation. It's not really anything other than a bunch of countries who said we can work together. So after years of infighting and years of control over natural resources, in fact, why does Germany like to invade France? Well, there's a little piece of land between the two that has lots of coal and lots of energy resources. Germany doesn't have it and France doesn't have it, but there's a little stretch of property right between the two that does, and they constantly have been fighting for hundreds of years over a little piece of land in between two great countries. So over 50 years, it starts forming voluntary by nature. Most European conflict, like I said, was over coal and steel. And by tying natural resources together, it prevents war. So they said, what if we just all work together? We're not going to fight. You get some coal and you get some steel. Everybody just works together and they share some energy and they share resources across a bunch of countries. Well, over time, of course, that also forms a little bit of a military to help back things up, and it creates a bunch of rules and regulations. And they start eliminating border checkpoints, because why can't I just walk over into somebody else's property? We talk about things like the border all the time in this country. We talk about different topics about how we control our own land, and they pretty much said, hey, just put a sign that says welcome. Be like driving from Dyer County to Obion County. You see the welcome to Obion County sign and you say, oh yeah, I'm almost home. Some people drive back and forth every day. Reducing the identity. So why was war always fought? Because my country's bigger and better than your country? Well, what if we get rid of that? So as all that goes across, how does this relate to Israel? Well, the European Union is Israel's largest trading partner. So the European Union is responsible for buying a lot of their grain from there, a lot of their resources, their clothing sometimes comes from Israel. They do a lot of trade, and they support what's called the two-state solution. See, what we didn't mention a second ago is that Israel and Palestine don't get along. If you've watched the news and you say where Israel's blown up Palestine and Palestine's trying to blow up Israel, historically they don't get along, they don't like one another, they can't stand one another. And that causes a conflict. And why is it a conflict? Well, Palestine technically says they were there first. It'd be the same, Mr. Bud, if we got land right next to one another, and Waylon, you're just right down the street from me. It'd be the same if we had our land right next to each other and the county said, now I get a little bit of your land and I'm going to get a little bit of yours and you're going to get just a small portion of mine, and it's going to be some of the better parts of the land. It's going to have good trading, it's going to have good crops, it's going to have a good creek for the cows and a good pond. And here we are, we're sitting there mad because we didn't even get a say in who got what land. We were happy with our land, and suddenly somebody just came through and said, all right, take a knife, we're just going to carve out what you need. That's why they started fighting. They already didn't like each other, and then somebody just said, all right, here you go, we're just going to put a new piece of property right here and put it on the map. So, EU, though, is, excuse me, the European Union is more critical of Israel than most of their partners. Every time that you see Israel form an attack, every time Israel has to respond to something, the European Union is right behind them saying, look, we love you guys, but you can't be doing this again. We might not trade with you tomorrow. We might put a restriction here or there, and it restricts constantly like that, and it's kind of a give or take. A lot of pastors over the last 25, 30 years, especially when the euro, which is their single currency in most of their countries, and 19 of 27 of their countries use one currency to make trading a little easier, is what they say. A lot of pastors said, well, that's the sign right there. They're going to use one world currency, and they're going to have one world government, one world of all types of things. So, when that forms and all these people form together, and then they're so critical of Israel, it makes them look like that they are, that they could be in. Well, a lot of pastors have changed their mind because the European Union is kind of failing. Every year it gets a little weaker. Y'all may remember, how many remember Brexit? Y'all heard that topic. The British, said, we don't want anything to do with y'all anymore. We want to have control over our own government just like we used to. And they broke ties. They had a big vote, and it came down right to the margin, and they split and went separate ways after years of infighting over who got what rule and who's trading with who. So, a lot of pastors and a lot of Bible scholars have moved away from the European Union for the simple fact that there may not be a European Union in 50 years. That does not say that tomorrow, and this is something that I would heed you all, whether I was talking about this topic or we were just talking on the street about something in the news, every day something changes. Well, I put part of this PowerPoint together about 2 months ago, and everything changed. In 2 months' time, I had to rewrite a large portion of this PowerPoint. So while Bible scholars are skeptical now, it could always change. Tomorrow, there could be a whole the European Union could quit all trade and could declare that Israel enemies of the world, and we start the end of times right then and there. I don't know. Most Bible scholars believe that the Antichrist will rise out of the European Union, though. Greece, a little island called Crete. You may have seen that on a map of the Mediterranean, sits right there in the middle. I've had a friend that has been there, said it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. But we all know that Obion County is a beautiful place. That doesn't mean that there's not people out stealing and doing whatever they want out of Obion County. Is there any questions so far? I know I'm covering things at a rapid speed. In 25 minutes, excluding the prayers, we've already gotten into the second half. So is there any questions so far? Any comments about what we've talked about? I mean, I'll cut whatever out of the video. If y'all are having trouble or y'all want me to clarify anything, I'm happy to. Without clarification, we don't learn. Because believe me, I'll say stuff all the time, and then I think, what did I just say? So I have to clarify myself quite a bit. Now, another country that comes out that people think in the end of times may be a major power to rise against God. I hear quite a bit from either popular pastors that talk on the subject or from the popular politicians that you see on the 5:30 news. But you hear about the People's Republic of China. China is a pretty large country. I've met several folks from China. A lot of them are good people. A lot of them are hardworking people. But they are not exactly the cultural breeding ground of change or opinions. Believe it or not, we're going to talk China is one of Israel's best friends. They get along great. They get along, in fact, we're putting them on the list only because they have such a large military. We're going to talk in just a second how Israel and China have been good friends for thousands of years. They've traded, when Israel was a kingdom, they traded with each other over the course of a long time. But the China that we know today is not the China that your great-grandparents know. China was formed today after a 35-year civil war. So people fought constantly, and they only took a break from fighting the Civil War to turn around and fight World War II. So, think about that. Look, I don't like you, can't stand you, but how about we shake hands for 5 years so we can go and shoot at somebody else? That's pretty much how they did it. The Japanese had invaded mainland China, and they said, "Hey, we got to all work together, or we're not going to get rid of our common threat." So, the Republic of China that we know, the People's Republic, comes across by somebody named Mao Zedong. You may have seen Chairman Mao. So occasionally, go to a college campus, you're going to see a kid wearing a Chairman Mao t-shirt. If only he knew. Maybe he knows, and that's a sad sign. But, see, there was a government in China. They were good to the U.S., they were good to Israel, they were good to everybody for the most part except the communists. And they were ran by a dictator. And the dictator, though, everybody liked him, at least over here. He didn't cause us any trouble. In fact, he worked with us. We fought alongside him in wars. And at some point in time, the people in China do not like him. So they run him, his family, and thousands of people to a small island off the coast of China that we now call Taiwan. And for years we said, okay, that's the real China. The other guys are just invaders. We're not going to recognize the China we know today. We're going to recognize this little bitty island as China. So if you go back and look at an old enough map, it's actually written that way. It'll say China, and it has Taiwan Island, and then it will say People's Republic, and it may say something under the line like illegitimate. So we were not friends with them for the longest time, and really Israel had strained relations because who are they supposed to be friends with? You got two people claiming to be the same person. The People's Republic of China does not allow freedom of speech. In fact, you and I would not be sitting in this church today had we been in China. Obviously, had we been in China, we wouldn't be in this building. But we also would not be allowed to worship God in the way and form and fashion that we do now. I went to, years ago, I had a doctor in Union City wanted me to meet some teenagers from China when I was a young kid. And they came out here, they swam in summertime. They were here like on an English exchange program. So they were over here to get better at English, to learn a few extra words in the vocabulary, to learn about America and about its culture. They could not believe that we actually elect people. They had no clue how even that would work. They had never seen an election. But on top of that, that was the first time that they had ever been in a Christian church was with me. They went on a Wednesday night to Woodland Mills with me. And when I asked somebody about getting them a Bible in Mandarin, they said, well, those are hard to come by around here. The Gideons just didn't have that resource. It'd take weeks. They were going to leave. They said, even if we did, it would almost be too dangerous to send them home with that Bible. We would have to actually get the Gideons to look into their exact address and make sure that it was safe to send it home with them because they could die. People got arrested in some parts of China for a lot worse. Religious minorities, excluding Israel, the Jewish people actually have very little reports of anti-Semitism. In fact, there's never been a report of it in the history of China. They have never had an actual documented case, according to China, and according to people who studied China and Israel, they've never had a moment that they said, well, that person, attacked that lady because of her faith. So, religious minorities are oppressed in China because they are an atheist country. The government is the final authority on everything. You don't agree with the government, then you're in trouble. So China, in most recent years, you may have heard of what's called the Uyghur Muslims, a group that's in the northwestern section of China. They've been targeted quite a bit. China built concentration camps, put them into slave labor, and then denied the whole thing. But China has targeted Christians in Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be part of England, and now they fight one another, at least in some form or fashion, because Hong Kong, a lot of people there want democracy, they want freedom. They said, look, we don't want to leave, we just want y'all to leave us alone. We'll pay our taxes or whatever we're supposed to do. Just let us worship God. Let us, have newspapers and books. There's cases where people who own bookstores going missing, never to be seen again. They're arrested in the middle of the night out of their home. Nobody even hears them arrested. Their family wakes up the next morning. Bob stepped out to pick up the paper off the street corner, and he's never seen again. Folks, and I don't think I have to tell you this, but I will anyways, we are incredibly blessed in this country. We can talk about, they won't let us do this, or my boss said we can't have prayer. Well, there's all types of things we can talk about that we're restricted on, but the government has not shown up yet, has not shown up to our houses and told us that we couldn't read a book. They've not shown up and told us that we can't go to church on a Sunday morning. Now, we can talk about New York State some other time during COVID and all that. That's a whole other topic. But we have not, as a nation, we really truly respect other people. You do your thing, I do mine. We can chat on the street corner. Until you hear about what goes on in China, and Joshua Wong I mentioned because I've actually had communication with him before he was sent to prison. But he is a Christian pro-democracy leader over in Hong Kong. Right now, somehow they keep finding things to charge him with. He gets a little closer to time for him to get out, and the court say, wait a minute, we got another charge for you. One of my favorite stories, he gets released from jail. He had been held for like a week in jail for protesting. They told him to go straight home. Do not pass go, but do not collect 200. Told him just to get out and go home and don't cause us any more trouble. And he walked out and chained himself to a statue in front of the police station and started protesting again. They walked out, they cut the chains off, took him right back inside and locked him right back up, and he spent a couple more weeks. But you don't remember Hong Kong, they had all that unrest, the umbrella movement years ago, and they had they shut down the whole financial district. He was 16. He led that. So there are people in China that are Christians who are trying to make a difference and trying to change things. China was always a poor country until recent years. And we are going to watch, a short clip. If we don't get to something, then Dad said I can have y'all next week. I may just let y'all have him. Believe it or not, this is the first time that I have taught a lesson like this since I was in school to teach. So this is a little bit of an upgrade. And I'll tell you before we watch the video, it's nice to have a captive audience that doesn't run around occasionally. But I do love y'all's children and grandchildren and relatives. But Richard Nixon decides to establish relations with Communist China. He looks at it as a political win. Economically, may not have been the best idea, but he looks at it as a good political win for us against Russia. China and Russia have been kind of at each other's throats over which practiced the better version of the same government. So we're going to watch a short clip from the Richard Nixon's library in California on how that took place. And hopefully we got sound here.
Nope, hit pause. Can you hit pause? We don't.
I hope I'm not boring y'all too much tonight. I can tell some of y'all are thinking, I did not come to church to hear this guy talk about politics and about world governments. But, I tell folks all the time, you can't understand what's going to happen in the Bible in the future. You can't understand the past unless you study it. Unless you know what's going to happen. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't sit here and predict the winning lotto ticket next week. I can't predict any of that, but I can think here that at the end of times, that if we walk away with anything tonight, it's an idea of what countries are out there. And by the way, China has one of the biggest militaries in the world. We've got better weapons, is what I always hear from people in the military. But they said if we just had to go hand to hand, they could take us out in a few years easy. We just don't have enough people willing to sign up constantly for the service. But let's see if we can. Let me take a second, Amber, I'm not sure.
On July 15th, 1971, President Nixon requested time on national TV.
The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China.
The effect was electric. The idea was almost unimaginable. The Washington Post said, if Mr. Nixon had revealed he was going to the moon, he could not have flabbergasted his world audience more. The Cold War was raging. In Southeast Asia, China was North Vietnam's ally, and Richard Nixon's credentials as an anti-communist were long-standing and impeccable. But in the fall of 1967, Nixon wrote a seminal article about Asia after Vietnam. Taking the long view, he wrote, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside the family of nations. There's no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. In January 1969, in his first inaugural address, President Nixon confirmed his determination to change America's policy toward China.
We seek an open world. A world in which no people, great or small, will live in angry isolation.
On February 17, 1972, after 2 years of secret and delicate negotiations, the President and First Lady were on their way to China. Premier Zhou Enlai was waiting in Beijing. In 1954, the U.S. Secretary of State had snubbed the then foreign minister. Nixon wrote in his memoirs, I knew that Joe had been deeply insulted by Foster Dulles' refusal to shake hands with him. When I reached the bottom of the steps, therefore, I made a point of extending my hand as I walked toward him. When our hands met, one era ended and another began. A few hours later, the President met with Chairman Mao Zedong. The 79-year-old leader was in frail health, but the lively hour-long meeting included philosophy, history, and banter. Mao said, I voted for you during your last election. Nixon said, I think the most important thing to note is that in America, at least at this time, those on the right can do what those on the left can only talk about. Throughout his career, Richard Nixon always reserved time for strategic thinking, making and refining extensive notes on yellow pads. In preparation for his China trip, he considered all the possible permutations of policy involved. What they want, what we want, what we both want. At the Great Hall of the People, the President and the Premier exchanged toasts.
Setting your toast, the Chinese people are a great people. The American people are a great people. We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today. What brings us together is that we have common interests which transcend those differences.
At the end of the trip, diplomatic ground was broken with the Shanghai Communique. After covering the points on which both sides had reached agreement, they proceeded to detail their different positions on all the other outstanding issues. Nixon referred to this in his final toast to Shanghai on the eve of his departure.
That communique will make headlines around the world tomorrow. But what we have said in that communique is not nearly as important as what we will do in the years ahead. We have been here a week. This was the week that changed the world.
I'll stop it there. I think it goes on for a few more seconds. But I show you that not to point out Richard Nixon as a great leader or anything like that. But I show you that though to talk for just a second. China went from one of the poorest countries in Asia with 1 billion or so people that had been put through famine several times, severe droughts, and somehow built one of the largest economies in less than 40 years. And that was the 1 week that set that in motion. and let me spin that off. You may be wondering why in the world. Let me spin that off. If 1 week changed the whole world, what could 1 minute do talking to somebody about Christ? We spend 1 little spare minute of our time. It could be as simple as saying Jesus loves you. You know that? If we spend a minute of our time, we heard Brother Tom the other day talk about how that with that one person that he spent just a few minutes and that person walked away saved. A person who just got out of prison, who'd been a member of the satanic movement. So, President Nixon, that's by the way Joshua Long, I forgot I had him mentioned on the other slide, but there's a picture of him there leading a demonstration. Joshua Long, which I've got his book about his time in prison that he spent, and it's a great read. But China's crackdown, though, shows that they're not willing to change. But however, they like Israel. And if you can make logical sense out of the world, you'll never do it. I can't begin to tell you how many times that I said in college, this makes absolutely no sense. But it was true. So Israel and China have great relations. They have century-old ties. Both of them they consider both to be ancient peoples. You know, Israel was there in the days of David, and they were there in the days of David as well in some form or fashion. And they have cultural similarities. And no, I'm not just talking about their use of soy sauce. They both like soy sauce on their food. If you ever look at recipes from both those countries side by side, they have a little bit of that in common. China and Israel have close military links. China is our biggest competitor at selling weapons to Israel for it to defend itself. We are constantly fighting at the Department of Defense over which next great weapon system we can sell to Israel before China figures out how to sell it first. Not just that we want the money off of it, but we want to be their friend just a little bit more than China, because China and us don't always get along. Chinese cooperation with Israel has concern, though, for Western nations. Like I said, military sales, and China supports that two-state solution of both Palestine and Israel just locking arms hand in hand. The next country, though, that I put on here because they have nuclear power, as in nuclear weapons, not that they got a nice generator somewhere, but they have nuclear weapons and do not like Israel. North Korea. North Korea is an atheistic, communistic nation state. If you want their official legal definition, they are a unitary Soviet republic with a hereditary totalitarian leadership. That's a mouthful. And North Korea is highly centralized. Nothing happens there without the approval of their leader. But you know who North Korea's founders' parents were? Christian missionaries? Well, okay, once again, it doesn't mean that it has to make sense for it to happen in the world. But their founder was not just terrible to Christians. He didn't like Christianity that much, but he loved Billy Graham. Billy Graham did more, is one of the only preachers to have preached at any major event in North Korea in the last 70 years. He led 3 or 4 rallies there, and he was always treated as one of the nicest people that they'd ever met. Then again, they didn't meet a lot of Americans over there. North Korea and Israeli relations, I put a quote here, is perhaps the most estranged non-relations in the international community. They refuse to recognize Israel as a sovereign nation. They denounce Israel as an imperialistic satellite of the United States. In other words, they think that we just control everything they do. Wouldn't that be nice to some extent? Because they don't. They recognize Muslim control of Palestine as the only legitimate nation there. They support missile technology to Israel's enemies and neighbors. And quite frankly, they have sold weapons to terrorists to plot against Israel. I put them in there not because this little bitty piece of a peninsula in Asia could just go and destroy and wipe out Israel, but they're already an enemy of God. When they don't view Israel, the United States, or any Christian nation, or any Christian at all, as a legal person or somebody that they have to at least respect. To me, they've already crossed the line. And now they have nuclear missiles that can reach Israel. Folks, I believe there's got to be a seventh great nation to rise up, because the Antichrist has to have a door. He has to have a way in. And even though he's been compared a lot to it, Russian Federation. Russia, I'm going to just kind of go pretty quick on this one. As we've seen in the last few months, Russia doesn't really have that good of an army. We thought they did. They told everybody they did. They just don't have one that's really... All religions are technically equal under the law. They don't have a state religion. However, they did pass a law in 2016 banning the sharing of the gospel. You cannot talk to people about Jesus in Russia. On the street, mission work, any of that cannot be done. That's why when they send money to people in Russia, it's always under like the Israeli Christian Leadership Council or some type of large group of people like that. You don't see just, Jim's going to go over there and help and do a mission project. I know people that aren't allowed in. I've heard of people being locked up for going over there to talk about Jesus. Their leader, to him, is more important. Russia and Israel have mostly decent foreign relations. They've had better times under Vladimir Putin when it comes to working with Israel. However, Russia also likes to give equipment to Israel's enemies to use against Israel. Kind of like we're friends, but I'm going to cut your tires in the parking lot. Israel often turns a blind eye to Russia when they are accused of things just to keep them, I guess, happy. And more recently, of course, we've seen Russia and Israeli relations are troubled because of ISIS, and I know nobody's forgotten ISIS in this short amount of time. Of course, we know about Ukraine. Ukraine is a majority Christian nation, majority Catholic. They were staying, for the most part, a Christian nation, even when they were under Russian rule and during the days of the Soviet. Ukraine was one of those places where people really like to sneak the gospel in. I have to put us in there. Not to talk about the current president, the current White House, the current leadership, past leadership, none of the big major topics or major names. Believe it or not, I was a little skeptical about doing this entire thing tonight because I have a strict don't talk politics in church policy. And Dad said, hey, I want you to talk about this. Sometimes, the part of the Bible that says, obey thy mother and father. So, the United States was founded in 1776. I don't have to probably give y'all the major backstory, but we are one of the Jewish people's greatest allies. Well, I mentioned that earlier. The first major Jewish population center was Charlestown back then, Charleston, South Carolina. We actually have a history of Jewish faith in Obion County. How many of y'all know where Bishop Street is? That was the first, and at one time, the only, and I guess still the only, Jewish neighborhood in Obion County. The first 6 houses there were Jewish merchants that lived in the area. They established a Jewish cultural center, later a synagogue right on the corner, right down from their houses. How many of y'all remember Schatz? Was it Schatz General Store way back when? Schatz? Well, if you go way back when, that was a Jewish family that owned that. One of the first Jewish stores opened in 1920. He actually wrote about it in somebody's memoir. She wrote about living in Union City when her dad opened the first store. She said they left here because we were too friendly to them. It scared them. The writer went to say, had this been 25, 30 years later, after World War II, we'd probably been happy that everybody was friendly to us there. America does have a history of anti-Semitism, and it's been amplified over the years, most predominantly by the Klan. If y'all ever get a chance and y'all want to just see how close that this area is to something bad happen, there's a map online. It's a hate map. What a wonderful title for a map. But it will show you what city that your local Klan and anything's in. We've got whole chapters in this region. I've actually found their literature at McDonald's when I worked there, sitting on top of a trash can right by the playland area. It is a real thing. America was the first major nation to recognize Israel. Eleanor Roosevelt was a big advocate for Israel. After her husband died, she kind of took over as, as the, not just the widow of the commander-in-chief, but she kind of took over a diplomatic role in trying to see through what he said about. A future could exist, though, of America not supporting Israel. We've seen people get elected to office that are anti-Israel, they're anti-Jewish. We've seen people, and there's people sitting in our current Congress and in our next Congress that support that. We also can exist, and there could be a world without America. Dad has always said, you notice America, they never mention even the West in the Bible. Say God showed John everything. He didn't show America. There's not a great nation to the west. There's none of that mentioned. We're here, but who knows for how long. The U.S. dollar, though, is the world's most traded currency. It is the de facto currency of many nations. So there are some countries that the U.S. dollar is their official currency, and they're not even American in territory. They have nothing to do with us except that the dollar is a better choice. When we went to the Bahamas as a little kid, the merchants down there absolutely loved the U.S. dollar. They wanted you to buy your stuff with the dollar. They had it written out there. They didn't like getting their own money because it wasn't worth as much. So it's also, though, when we trade with Israel, when Israel trades with the world, they do so in dollars, even with China, even with the European Union. They trade in those currencies. But we are one of the world's largest militaries. We are one of the world's greatest powers. I'm not saying that because I love my country, and I do. I'm saying that because the numbers speak volumes. Mr. Bud, you were talking earlier to me before the service. You were talking about, I'm trying to think here, you said that 90% of the world lived in the northern hemisphere, and I mentioned, us being a great military power. And you said, well, for right now, or they're working on their way out of it. We do not really have a lot of push and pull with our social policy. We're considered behind the times of Europe when it comes to healthcare and several other areas. Now I say we got better healthcare, that's another story. But we are a little behind the times in several areas. Where have we always, though, stood out for the last 125 years? We have a military that will crush you if you don't do what we want. And that actually is how we got several pieces of land in the Pacific. But we took over the island of Guam just because we wanted to. They didn't even really know that there was a war going on. But the one area of the world that I have been asked about the most over the years, and not even in the topic of the 7 great world powers, but when I tell people that I have a degree to teach government in history, and they say, oh, what about the Middle East? The Middle East has got to be in the end of times. And I think they are. I mean, obviously Israel's in the Middle East. But is the Middle East going to be the group that just takes the world out? How many of y'all would think they're going to play a major role? Just a show of hands real quick. Do you think that they're going to play some type of major role in the end days? Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt they're not going to play some type of role. But folks, the Middle East has to be at peace with Israel first. You got to have 3.5 years of peace. I mean, Israel's got to have locking arms and singing Kumbaya for a little while. And so far, they're not doing that too well. But, excuse me, before a Jewish nation state existed, the Arab world has always had issues with Judaism. And we're just about done. I know I'm keeping y'all 2 minutes over so far. During the Crusades, Muslims and Christians and Jews all have fought over the same city, Jerusalem. You see, folks, Muslims believe that the Temple Mount, where Solomon had built his temple, where King Herod had expanded the temple, where Jesus pitched a hissy fit over people selling stuff in the temple, and that little section there, they believe is their land. Because they believe the Prophet Muhammad went to heaven the first time before he came back down on earth and died a natural death and was buried. By the way, you can see where he's buried. You can't see where Jesus is buried. Rose again already. But they fight over that one Temple Mount, really. Now, do they want the McDonald's right down the street? I don't know. But they want that one piece of land that exists there. And at one time, at the time of the creation of the Jewish state, Palestine existed in historic Judea of Christ's time, known at this point as the Levant. It's a piece of land that, what Levant means, if you translate it, is a land without Israel. They do not include Israel. They include Palestine, but not Israel. At one time, though, Christians and Jews mostly got along in this area until about 1916, when a bunch of people decided to carve up the land that they technically didn't own and say, we're going to call this area mine and that area yours. And they started fighting over who got to what piece of land. Those borders were still there, and one of ISIS's first goals was to get rid of those borders to claim it's all theirs. Christians and Jews live peacefully in most Muslim countries today. You know, I've met people from Saudi Arabia when I was in college. I talked to them a little bit about Jesus. They talked to me a little bit about Muhammad, and we didn't have any trouble fighting with each other. They did tell me to keep my voice down because I talk loud, and Saudi Arabia is known if they hear somebody being witnessed to of that person's family not coming home. So I did have to keep my voice down. Mom may tell you that's impossible. But Israel was formed as a Jewish state and of land that we already talked about called Mandatory Palestine, the mandated land, basically. The Economist, which is a great political publication that I like to reference, I one time read an article about one of their editors, and they asked, why do we not get along? How come we have too much in common? We all come from Abraham's concept of what religion is. We went three separate ways. We went one way at first, and then we split from there, and the Abrahamic religion went to Judaism, to Christianity, and then to Islam, and we just split and went three different ways. But it may be because we have too much in common. Folks, Muslims do believe in Jesus. They don't believe he's the Savior, but they believe in him. Y'all may have seen this, and I'm wrapping up very quickly. The Abraham Accords that came out a few years ago tried to establish peace with Israel. And so far been okay, been successful. Funny enough, yesterday they met in Rome and had a global leadership conference to try to see what they can do next year. And by putting more countries in the Abraham Accords and more Middle Eastern countries coming to like Israel. So this is something that's actually happening right now. It's not me spouting off ancient history like I did earlier. Several other nations have worked to normalize relationships. And funny enough, it was a big deal, but the first regularly scheduled flight between Saudi Arabia and Israel took place. It was against the law for a Saudi to fly to Israel and for an Israeli plane to fly into Saudi Arabia. And they finally paved the way and said, okay, I guess we can at least have our airplanes go back and forth. They even started playing soccer against each other. That's a big deal over there, not big here, but it'd be like football being our type of football being a global phenomenon instead of just an American thing. And last but not least, in the Middle East is Iran, or Iran technically. Despite a change in tone with several major Arab nations, Iran still hates us. They still hate Israel. In fact, they continued to call Israel Little Satan and us Big Satan. So they're not exactly our best friends. They practice something called Sharia law, which is religious law that's based on what most Muslims probably would say is antiquated teachings. Stuff that goes back to the days of Islam's founding. It'd be like, how many of y'all have actually looked in the Old Testament and you go past the Ten Commandments and you just keep reading some of the rules that people had to follow in the Bible. We couldn't have shrimp, by the way. Couldn't have crawdad fish out, couldn't fry that type of food up. We couldn't have bacon tomorrow morning. Waylon, I'm sorry, you'd be out of business. No sausage in that world. Well, they practice a similar law, and I've just picked out the easy ones to remember. But, they have to wear certain face coverings. They have to, I had a friend of mine, he was my professor, Dr. Malcolm Cook. And he used to live in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And, of course, Sharia law is somewhat in effect there. His wife could not go anywhere without a man. She couldn't go to the market unless she had somebody with her to approve of her purchases. She didn't like that, but she said it was nice not having to drive. She had a chauffeur. She was a newspaper journalist for like the New York Times, and they just took her everywhere. So she had her own chauffeur and had a photographer, and she didn't have to do anything but write the story. But he used to be delivering lectures in a big banking building. He would be going over world banking figures. That's what he did at the time. And you can see the bombs going off in the distance, about 10 miles in the distance. See the smoke coming out of the desert from them fighting each other. He said it made something fun to write about years later, but it wasn't fun at the time. So, a lot of churches have changed, in Christianity, have changed their rules up. Used to, a man and woman couldn't enter the same door of this church. There's pictures of that. Well, now we have no trouble walking in the same door together, and sometimes we have to walk a long way around during construction, but we have no trouble with that. Now, Muslim fundamentalists strongly believe, though, that Sharia law is divided into two sets. There's rules that are in the Quran that, this is like our Old Testament rules. They're not going to touch them. You can't, that goes against our teachings. And then they say, all right, the rest are just based on what Muhammad said. So that's not exactly addressed. In fact, somebody told me one time that Islam's biggest failure is that they haven't examined their laws in about 1,800 years. So, you can imagine if we still had a rule that said you couldn't ride your horse and buggy down a certain street in town, and everybody was told that, okay, that applies to cars too, that we would have a street here but nobody can go down, you got to walk. And in Union City, that wouldn't go over too well. Terrorism in and around Israel. Iran likes to fund different Arab nations to attack Israel, and they have a long-standing goal of eventually launching a nuclear weapon. What can make Israel not loved, though, by the world? They have nuclear capability, thanks to us. And if they used one of those weapons, and it wasn't what you were supposed to do, let's say they just, somebody got into power and said, I'm just going to blow up Jordan, I'm going to blow up Saudi Arabia, the United States may have to back off and say, wait a minute, we can't be your friend if you're going to act like this. And that may cause that conflict that's needed to create all that fight and all that push and pull that is needed for the end of times to really take place. Can y'all imagine what the news would look like if Israel or us had blown up somebody with a nuclear weapon? It'd be nonstop coverage for years. ISIS did rise out of that area, though, claimed to be a world caliphate, which means they claim to have a worldwide government, a one world, one currency, one religion government. That's why I include them. Even though they have lost power, they still have a lot of influence in certain little communities. We rent them out most places, but occasionally they pop up in the news for something that they claim that they have done, or we're taking out one of their leaders, or we've done something. So they are still around. They just got quiet. And sometimes the scariest person is the one who gets quiet. I know several of y'all might be scaring me tonight, but that's all right. A caliphate, like I said, is a political religious state. Imagine if you took the Vatican in Rome and you made it the Holy Roman Emperor like it used to be, where it was a large land governed under one religion and one law and one ruler. ISIS's goal was to conquer the entire world, eliminate all other religions other than Islam, and destroy Hamas, which was a group that opposed Israel, so they could be the group to oppose Israel. And take out my enemy in order to fight my own enemy. It makes no sense. Once again, it doesn't have to for people to do it. ISIS also was really looking forward to Armageddon in the Bible. They wanted to be the people to oppose God in the end days. They prophesied it. They talked about it. They preached about it. They blew up churches and talked about it. They converted churches and Christian schools into Muslim schools. They converted Christian churches. They destroyed works of art about Jesus Christ. They destroyed works of art about anything that they viewed that went against what they wanted. There are some groups out here, I try to be unbiased if I talk about things, but there are some groups out here that you just can't be quiet about and you can't just sit back. And if ISIS folks ever rises to power again and they form a new government and they take over a nuclear facility or they take over parts of Israel and we have to respond, that could be what sets the Antichrist up to walk out and say, I've got the solution. I know what we're about to do. I know how we're about to do it. They, like I said, believe they will defeat the army of Rome. By the way, who can tell me what church is based out of Rome? The Catholics and the Christian church has got a strong presence in Rome. They are very focused on the study of the Muslims' version of the end of times. Most Muslims, though, I want you to know, most Muslims consider ISIS or ISIL, depending on who you ask, or even, I believe it's Doc, which is another word that means, it's actually an insult. It's kind of like a dirty word in that language to refer to somebody as illegitimate. But most Muslims consider ISIS to be illegitimate. They do not have a widespread support in their own community because ISIS tortures them too. It's not that they may not believe something that they're doing, but when a little girl can't go to school anymore and she loves to learn about reading or loves to learn math, or a Christian, I read about a Christian who stayed over there in Syria and had to hide his candles at Christmas. He had to hide everything that he owned almost every week because the police would come up there and check on him. He was allowed to live there, he just couldn't practice what he wanted to. Please note, though, that less than 1%, or far less than 1% of Muslims want this. Most of them that I've ever talked to, most of them that anybody has ever talked to, says they just want to go about their day and live in a world in peace. We know that there are groups out there that are technically Christian terrorist organizations in the course of our history. But that does not mean that we are all supporting them because we're Christian. It means that there's a group out there that needs to get back on their medicine. And that's it. Is there any questions or anything? I know I went through stuff pretty quick, and I appreciate y'all sitting here with that look of boredom on your face that my students had when I first taught something like this at Dyer County High School in my student teaching. But at least none of y'all seem to have just completely dozed off or started throwing things. I didn't have that happen. But is there any questions? I know that y'all, it doesn't probably feel like y'all had Bible study, but I feel like we've at least, if you walk away with something, walk away with how blessed we are. How blessed we are to have this church, for one, and with a new pastor coming in, and the fact that we're growing, but how blessed we are as a nation, and that believes in the simple phrase, freedom of religion. Means that you and I can go about our day and not worry about the big bad wolf coming to get us. and somebody else that's completely different from us, that, and I'm not just talking about the Baptist and Methodist, but somebody really different from us that even practices no religion can go about their day, and they may have to hear me talk about Jesus, but they don't have to worry about going to prison because they don't believe in him. Or they don't have to worry about going to prison because they don't believe anything at all. There are some folks out there in this very country that want to see Israel destroyed. That's a fact. I'm not talking politics at this point. I'm just spewing real facts. There are people in this country that want to see America fight Israel, and they want to provoke. Look, folks, I want God to come back. I want the Lord to come back just like anybody else and get rid of the evils and the dangers of this old world. But let me tell you today, if it's the last thing that I get to say in this church, y'all may run me out after this tonight, that if we as Christians don't stand up against some of that stuff, and I'm not talking about going out and voting for some crazy person because they're the only one up there that dances a certain dance or spews something out of their mouth the other person won't dare say, or forget something that the other person shouldn't forget. I'm talking about if we do not stand up, though, for our own values, then the world will walk all over our values. And I think we've all seen that enough in recent years. This shows y'all a little glimpse. There's over 200 countries in the world, and y'all seen a glimpse of about 7 or 8 different nations and political entities, including ourselves, that might push that button and launch that bomb that destroys everything and makes us start all over, or brings about God quicker than anything. What would he say how we treat his creation? I heard a British pastor the other day say that. Would he be appalled at how we just kill things because we need to kill it and sell it on the market? Like, and I'm not poking fun at Williams, but Williams Sausage and all their pigs, or Tyson and all their chickens. You know, God may be, and the Lord would be appalled at what we've done to his creation sometimes, and how we just throw it away, and how we just should walk all over the earth that he created, and we trample it and don't pick up. I tell the kids every Wednesday night, clean up after yourself and leave the church a better place than you found it. If there's no other questions, if there's no any comments or concerns, or if you got something after, I'm more than happy to talk to you afterwards about any of these topics. I know sometimes you have questions you don't want anybody else to hear, and I get that. Waylon, would you please dismiss us?
Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you again for this day. We thank you for allowing us to gather in your house, Lord. Lord, we thank you for the great nation you allow us to live in, Lord. Lord, we pray for these people who are punished for their beliefs in these other countries, Lord, and that one day we'll all be together in your kingdom, Lord, worshiping you together. Lord, we ask until that day that you just lead, guide, direct us, and continue to help us where we fail you, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.